There's actually real concern within the health service, according to the Labour Party, at least, over this elective recovery task force. Now, this was a whole scheme. It was unveiled at the end of last year to say that within the NHS you could then use the private sector, private healthcare, to try and bring down this waiting list of people who are waiting more than 18 months for some surgery. Is it working? Is it not? Let's talk to the chair of the Labour Party, Anneliese Dodds, who joins us now. Good morning to you. I know you've got some real concerns over this, haven't you?
Good morning. Yes, we have, because we see at the moment over 7.3 million people on an NHS waiting list. And the government promised with a huge blaze of publicity that they were going to do something about this with the task force that you just mentioned. Well, actually, we still haven't seen the outcomes from that task force being published. And this is a big problem. You know, Labour's calculated that if we'd seen spare capacity in the private sector being used from the moment when Labour called for that, which was last January, almost 300,000 people could actually have received treatment. You know, lots and lots of people now are going to the private sector for treatment. They're feeling forced to do that because they're on such a long NHS waiting list. But of course, there are so many others who simply can't afford to do that. This is a really unfair situation, and the Conservative government needs to get a grip and actually be making sure they are straining every sinew to get waiting lists down, just as Labour would do.
How would Labour then tackle that? 7.3 million people on the NHS waiting list, as you say. I mean, would you use the private sector in order to get that waiting list down?
Well, yes, that's what we actually called for in January of last year. And if government had heeded our calls back then, as I said, we could have seen, I think it's about 280,000 more operations taking place, more procedures taking place. Now, we really need to see that urgent action because of the impact that these waiting lists are having on people's lives. You know, I've been speaking with a young constituent of mine. She was told over a year ago that she urgently needed an operation. Over a year of waiting now, and she and her parents were told that actually if they could have afforded to go private, then she would have had that operation many months before. That's wrong. We actually need to see a system where people are getting the treatment that they need as quickly as possible, and that's what Labour would be doing.
Well, yeah, it is wrong, and people do need to be seen quickly. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But it is about how you do it. I mean, the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, said, as you've just said, Labour would use spare capacity in the private sector to get patients seen faster and free at the point of use. But only earlier this month, the Health Foundation said that using the private sector can only have a very limited impact on the waiting list backlog. So, I mean, even if you implemented that, it's not, according to the Health Foundation, isn't going to do what you want.
Well, actually, analysis indicates that you could have seen up to 300,000 more procedures taking place. And I think for those patients, it wouldn't have been minimal. But I do understand what the Health Foundation is talking about for the long term, because we need to get a grip on the real crisis for the long term, make sure that we're boosting NHS numbers. And that's why Labour said that we would be taking difficult choices here. We would cancel the non-dom tax exemption and use that money to massively boost our NHS workforce. And that would mean that our NHS would be fit for the future. You know, we want an NHS where no one feels that they have to go private, because the NHS will be working so well that they won't need to even be considering that. That is going to take, however, some time. That requires that long-term plan for staffing that Labour set out and which we're absolutely determined to deliver.
I wanted to ask about the front of the Daily Express this morning. It's Rishi Sunak very confidently saying he's going to be PM for years to come. He says he is going to be Prime Minister. He's going to win the next election. What did the Labour Party say to that? Are you going to be just as determined to win the next election?
Well, we're certainly just as determined, and I think the electorate are pretty determined at the moment as well, because people voted up and down England to actually reject Conservative councillors at the time of the last local elections, and very often they voted Labour, particularly in key marginal seats, to show that they wanted a change in government. They wanted that better future with Labour, and I'm confident that we will have a majority Labour government at the next election if we keep setting out the big choices that Labour would be making, very different choices to those being taken by the Conservatives.
But this is where it gets confusing. It's all about honesty with people. That matters, doesn't it? And, you know, straight after those local elections, Keir Starmer came out and said, we're on track for a majority government at the next general election. Well, that's not what the analysts say. The analysts say we're on track for a hung parliament.
Well, I think actually what most analysts were very upfront about was the fact that because these elections were only in England, they didn't reflect what's been taking place in Scotland. And in Scotland, Labour has been moving forward. You know, we've seen a real change in Labour's fortunes north of the border. Why is that important? Because that signals that we will be in a stronger position that would have been indicated from any projections from the local elections. But also, I think many analysts said very clearly that when you look at where Labour won, we were picking up seats in those key marginal areas. So looking just at the overall vote share, for example, isn't that helpful when indicating what the situation will be at a general election. And actually, most analysts that I've heard from have been really upfront about that, and they've been really clear about that. I think that's quite right.
Yeah, except that within, I mean, certainly within some of the key red wall areas, which we know heavily voted Brexit, which is why perhaps they were backing Boris Johnson in 2019. A lot of those, he said, in the local elections went back to the Labour Party. However, then this week, Keir Starmer says, I'm going to renegotiate the Brexit deal if I get into power. That's going to turn those people off, isn't it?
Well, actually, I've had a lot of conversations with people up and down the country, including in many areas where lots of people voted for Brexit. And Labour's been clear that we are not going to rejoin the EU. We are going to be putting our country first. And sadly, that's not what the Conservative government has been doing around trade, for example. You know, we've got a ridiculous situation at the moment where we've got huge amounts of red tape at our borders for British businesses to try and contend with. And you've got countries like Australia, for example, that are obviously not in the EU, but that have got a veterinary agreement with the EU. Now, why on earth can't the UK have that so that we can strip away that red tape? So Labour is focused on practical changes to actually make Brexit work so that we're not seeing our businesses being harmed by what has been a really unhelpful approach from the Conservative government, which hasn't always put our economic interest first.